Naturalization and registration. Today I'm going to talk about the differences between these two avenues, both from a guidance point of view as well as a statutory point of view. Both these routes lead to an applicant becoming a British citizen, but they are vastly different. Often applications get refused because applicants who should really apply for naturalization might apply instead for registration, and vice versa. Naturalization and registration are both governed not exclusively but mainly by the British Nationality Act of 1981. Generally, naturalization by Section 6, whereas registration is governed by a few different sections, such as Section 1, Section 3, Section 4, specifically Section 4C, and more recently Section 4L. These applications, when considered, one should really look at the statute, so the law itself. Case law also comes into play, especially with requirements under Section 4C in the case of Romain, and also the guidance. It's particularly important to understand that even though the Nationality Acts might not change frequently, the Home Office's internal guidance policies do change. This would affect things like the way in which one applies some specific requirements, for example, clarity or new clarity on the good character requirement that was recently released as of March 2026. Therefore, when considering a registration or a naturalization application, don't just look at the law, also look at the guidance in order to avoid potential hiccups or refusals further down the line. Naturalization. So what is naturalization? Generally speaking, naturalization is an application made under Section 6 of the British Nationality Act of 1981. Generally, it's a case of applicants having spent time on different routes prior to obtaining indefinite leave to remain, also known as settlement or settled status, in the United Kingdom, who then apply to be naturalized as a British citizen, with the results that if one has a child born abroad thereafter, that naturalized citizenship can be passed on, leading to that child being British by descent. Naturalization, however, is not a right, it's a privilege to become a British citizen, and it's very much discretionary. There are many different factors that come into play on whether or not one would be granted British citizenship by way of naturalization, such as the good character requirement, the residency requirement, in other words, how many days over the preceding years one were absent from the UK, also one's intent to make the UK your permanent home upon being granted British citizenship, and of course things like the forms even having just to be filled in correctly and the correct version of the application forms having to be completed. Oftentimes there is a bit of a paradox or a seeming paradox between the requirements under the immigration rule to obtain indefinite leave to remain and the requirements to obtain naturalization. What I'm referring to by way of example is if one were to apply for indefinite leave to remain pursuant to being on a spouse visa, one has to, as of right now, March 2026, have 5 years residency, lawful residency in that category, and also meet other requirements, but basically have those 5 years residency, and one would then obtain indefinite leave to remain. When one, however, looks at the requirements of the Nationality Act, one only has to have 3 years residency. The reason behind this is simply because prior to 2012, one had to have only spent 2 years in the United Kingdom, whereupon one would have been granted indefinite leave to remain, and 1 year later, thus 3 years in total, one would have been able to apply for naturalization. Therefore, when one looks currently at the requirements to be naturalized if you are married to a British citizen, it seems that you only have to spend 3 years in the United Kingdom. But the rub, however, lies in the fact that you first have to have indefinite leave to remain, which means you have to spend 5 years in the United Kingdom. These are just one of the many matters that gets very confusing to our clients, and we advise legal advice be sought to clarify. What is registration as a British citizen? Effectively, registration oftentimes applied to minor children or those who were previously disadvantaged by discriminatory practices of previous legislation, or those who, through some form of gap in statutes, could not previously apply at the time of their birth to become British citizens. British children who were born abroad under certain circumstances can be registered as British, and oftentimes it is not clear whether or not they can be indeed registered. These laws are very much varied and they depend heavily on case law. For example, Section 4C, that relates back to historic gender discrimination against women, where women couldn't pass on their British citizenship to their children born abroad. And this Section 4C was more recently expanded by virtue of Section 4L to cater for applicants in order for them to be able to apply under further, more varied circumstances. Registration is, generally speaking, not a right. It is also discretionary. However, there are certain routes where if one can show, and bear in mind the onus is always on the applicant to provide the evidence that the Home Office requires, but if one can satisfy the Home Office based on specific routes, then it is in fact a right to be registered as British, and it is not discretionary. It is very important when considering an application to pick the right route from the beginning. Oftentimes, one would apply for naturalisation when in fact you don't qualify for naturalisation. However, you would qualify for British citizenship by way of registration. The requirements, the routes are very different and distinct from one another. To avoid going down the wrong path and possibly spending substantial funds and effort pursuing a specific route to citizenship, it is better to take legal advice. Make sure you are on the right track. Make sure that you have the evidence to hand that the Home Office will require, so as to avoid delays later on, and your chances of success be massively improved.